Frank Sinatra helped the underworld legitimize millions of dollars in Las Vegas, but he had his front teeth punched out by a casino manager when his gambling credit ran out. The superstar smashed furniture to assert his dominance, but ultimately ended up collapsed on the hotel carpet with a mouthful of blood. Stripped of his honor by a direct punch to the face, he was forced to bitterly pack his bags and leave, continuing to sign contracts, selling his voice to another casino. The crowd still hailed him as the chairman, completely blind to the fact that their idol had just been punished by the capitalists with street violence. How pragmatic were the rules established by Las Vegas to be able to crush the arrogance of a Hollywood monument with just a single punch? A voiceless, financially ruined idol, discarded by a ruthless corporate machine, stood in stark contrast to the swaggering king of the Nevada desert he would soon become. Stripped of his defining voice and income in the early 1950s, he experienced a profound, humiliating collapse. Yet, from this absolute professional destruction, he emerged as the undisputed face of a glittering new empire. Did the brutal rejection by traditional Hollywood actually serve as the exact catalyst required for his dark rebirth in Las Vegas? To survive this devastating professional exile, he executed a calculated submission by accepting a heavily discounted acting role. While his raw, emotionally devastating performance successfully resurrected his public career, the trauma of industry-wide rejection left a permanent scar. He realized that traditional studios were dangerously fickle, governed entirely by shifting public relations. He quietly, deeply vowed to never again allow a boardroom of corporate executives to hold power over his livelihood. Driven by this unyielding resolve, he decisively turned his back on the fragile traditional corporate structures of California. He urgently sought an alternative, unassailable power, so urge, that operated far beyond the restrictive reach of studio politics. This desperate pursuit led him directly into the unregulated, scorching desert of Nevada. There, an expanding, extraordinarily lucrative entertainment frontier offered the exact leverage and protection he desperately needed. By forging quiet alliances within this burgeoning Nevada landscape, he found the raw, untouchable backing he required. He traded corporate vulnerability for a rock-solid foundation that traditional studios could never threaten or dismantle. Consequently, he firmly positioned himself at the absolute center of the city's most prosperous, glamorous era. He effectively transformed his deepest professional vulnerabilities into the bedrock of his reign over Las Vegas. Las Vegas in the late 1950s and early 1960s was not a sanitized, publicly traded corporate theme park. It was a ruthlessly efficient, meticulously organized money laundering machine. It was built, funded, and operated with brutal, violent precision by the American mafia. Specifically, the desert territory was heavily controlled by the Chicago outfit and various high-ranking families of La Cosa Nostra, operating out of New York and Kansas City. To keep the federal government away and to prevent local law enforcement from looking too closely at their ledgers, the mob desperately needed a massive, mesmerizing diversion. They needed to attract the ultra-wealthy, legitimate gamblers. They needed the Hollywood elite, the Texas oil barons, and the East Coast industrialists who possessed millions of clean, legitimate dollars to lose. To accomplish this, they needed a premium, globally recognized public relations officer. They needed an entity who could instantly legitimize their criminal empire to the American public. They specifically chose Frank Sinatra. He was the most famous entertainer on the planet, freshly resurrected from his career death and harboring a massive bruised ego. Sinatra did not stumble into this arrangement he meant blindly. He enthusiastically embraced it. He willingly became the ultimate glamorous magnet. He was a perfectly tailored lure, designed specifically to draw the immense greed of the American public directly onto the casino floor. While Sinatra stood on the glittering stage of the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel, he radiated unshakable power. He drew the unwavering attention of the global elite and legitimate politicians. He commanded deafening standing ovations and dictated the cultural rhythm of the city. But a much darker systematic financial operation was happening directly beneath his feet. Down in the windowless, heavily guarded basement counting rooms of the casino, mafia associates were meticulously executing a massive federal crime. This organized financial theft was known strictly in the underworld as skimming. The process was brutally simple, efficient, and prosecutable under federal racketeering laws. Every night, the casino generated staggering volumes of legitimate revenue. Before this nightly influx of cash was officially counted, documented, and reported to the Nevada state tax authorities, the mob intervened. Trusted, carefully vetted operatives quietly and systematically siphoned off 20 to 30% of the raw, untraceable cash directly from the counting tables. They targeted the heavy drop boxes pulled from the baccarat, craps, and blackjack pits. They did not take casino chips. They took strictly untraceable high-denomination cash. Heavy leather suitcases stuffed entirely with crisp $100 bills were secured. These suitcases were quietly loaded onto private planes, waiting on the tarmac at a nearby desert airstrip. These planes flew under the cover of darkness straight back to the violent mob bosses operating in Chicago and the Midwest. This untaxed illicit capital successfully funded the mafia's national operations. It paid for political bribes, union corruption, and expansive narcotics networks across the country. Sinatra's soaring, legendary vocals up in the showroom were essentially functioning as the glamorous background music for an ongoing federal crime. He was the glittering, heavily insured shield that kept the FBI agents out of the basement. To ensure Sinatra remained a fiercely loyal and willing participant in this grand deception, the mafia masterfully manipulated him. They fed his fragile, deeply damaged ego using brilliant, calculated psychological tactics. The hardened mob bosses understood human psychology flawlessly. They knew that a man who had survived absolute public humiliation in 1950 craved one thing above all else. He craved supreme, unquestioned authority. They bestowed upon him the grand corporate title of chairman of the board. This title was purely cosmetic. It carried zero actual legal weight in the mafia's rigid, violent hierarchy, but it successfully fed Sinatra's intense pathological need for dominance. He needed to feel that he was no longer an employee. He needed to feel like a boss. To further cement this illusion, the mob gave him a 9% phantom ownership stake in the Sands Hotel. They needed him to feel like a legitimate corporate owner, not just a hired lounge singer performing for a weekly paycheck. They granted him a completely unlimited line of casino credit. He was allowed to gamble millions of dollars of the house's money at the tables. He never faced a collection agent. He never had a debt marker called in. The casino accountants were strictly instructed to ignore his massive mounting losses. Furthermore, the criminal organization tolerated his famously arrogant, demanding, and often physically explosive behavior. He was known to demolish expensive hotel suites when he was angry. He routinely and physically assaulted service staff, casino managers and journalists, the hardened mob bosses, men who routinely ordered assassinations calmly wrote these violent incidents off in their accounting ledgers. They viewed his outburst simply as a necessary operational cost of doing business. Replacing a smashed television, rebuilding a wrecked hotel suite, or paying thousands of dollars in medical hush money to a beaten waiter was much cheaper than launching a national advertising campaign. Sinatra's presence generated far more money than his temper destroyed. Sinatra genuinely, deeply believed the mafia's carefully constructed lie. He believed he was a true godfather. He believed he was an untouchable boss who walked shoulder to shoulder with the most dangerous, powerful men in America. He never realized the stark forensic reality of his position. He was simply a high-end dock worker. He was a valuable biological asset being ruthlessly squeezed by the mob. They utilized him solely to generate a glamorous, prominent revenue shield for the real architects of the desert city. During the grueling 4-week production of the heist film Ocean's 11 in early 1960, Sinatra essentially commandeered the entire municipal infrastructure of Las Vegas. He instituted a punishing, relentless physical schedule for his inner circle. The Rat Pack shot the major studio picture across various casinos during the daylight hours and performed 2 consecutive, heavily attended shows in the Copa Room every single night. This specific concentrated period of entertainment, billed by the casinos as the Summit at the Sands, triggered an unprecedented explosive economic boom in the Nevada desert. Over 34,000 desperate tourists flooded into the city, vastly exceeding the available hotel capacity. Legitimate, wealthy gamblers literally slept in their parked cars along the barren desert highways just to be in the immediate vicinity of Sinatra's operational base. Furthermore, Sinatra aggressively used his newfound leverage to terraform the actual physical and cultural landscape of the city. Before his dominance, Las Vegas was largely a dusty, Western-themed cowboy stopover, characterized by sawdust floors and Cassie UL attire. Sinatra rejected this aesthetic with sheer contempt. He forced the casino owners to tear out the rustic interiors and install heavy plush carpeting and imported crystal chandeliers. He implemented and enforced a mandatory, high-end dress code for the showrooms. He refused under any circumstances to sing for any patron wearing denim, casual shoes, or short sleeves, regardless of how much money they had lost at the tables. He demanded a sea of custom tuxedos and expensive evening gowns. Jack and Tratter, the imposing president of the Sands, effectively functioned as his personal logistics officer, bending the entire corporate infrastructure of the hotel to ensure Sinatra's suites were perpetually stocked with specific imported Italian silks and specialized vocal remedies. Sinatra was not merely an entertainer during this era. He was the undisputed tyrannical architect of the modern Las Vegas aesthetic. The operational mechanics of his Copa Room residency were staggering. Sinatra commanded a strict, grueling schedule of 2 shows a night at 8:15 p.m. and midnight, 7 days a week during his engagements. The intimate showroom held only 400 seats, making it the most exclusive high-demand ticket in the United States. During a typical 4-week run, Sinatra personally generated over $1.5 million in legitimate reported box office revenue for the Sands, an astronomical sum for the era. The sheer unpredictability of his Las Vegas performances became a weaponized marketing tool. The Sands stopped printing conventional showtimes or guaranteed lineups. The massive neon marquee looming over the strip often displayed a deliberately vague message. Frank Sinatra, maybe Dean, maybe Sammy. This calculated ambiguity generated widespread psychological desperation among tourists. It engineered an intense fear of missing out, forcing wealthy patrons to spend consecutive nights gambling heavily at the tables, just to ensure they were inside the Copa Room when a spontaneous Rat Pack reunion occurred. A ruthless secondary economy instantly materialized around his presence. Desperate high rollers routinely slipped $100 bills to the brutal maitre d', simply to secure a folding chair near the kitchen doors. Sinatra had successfully commodified unpredictability, turning his own chaotic social life into a measurable, heavily taxable casino asset. This concentration of wealth and power turned the Copa Room seating chart into a sensitive geopolitical minefield. Jack and Tratter meticulously orchestrated the room. On any given night, high-ranking violent members of the Lucchese and Colombo crime families were seated at VIP booths located just feet away from sitting U.S. senators, federal judges, and undercover FBI agents. The federal government was actively and aggressively watching him. The FBI eventually compiled a massive 2,400-page classified dossier on Sinatra. Federal agents physically trailed him across the casino floor. They documented his late-night meetings. They recorded the exact times he sat at the baccarat tables with known, dangerous associates like Meyer Lansky's lieutenants. Sinatra knew the agents were in the audience, and he routinely and publicly mocked them from the stage, pointing them out to the laughing crowd. He felt entirely protected by the invisible, violent shield of his underworld partners. Furthermore, his stage shows were not traditional, disciplined musical performances. They were aggressive, choreographed displays of excess. He pioneered the concept of the on-stage bar, demanding that a fully stocked rolling cart of Jack Daniels and ice be pushed directly out to the microphone. He smoked constantly while singing. He freely threw heavy $100 casino chips to the waitstaff as tips. He transformed the act of singing into a brazen exhibition of untouchable, unregulated power. To maintain this suffocating illusion of absolute control, Sinatra refused to walk through the public casino floors like a normal patron. He utilized a network of subterranean service tunnels beneath the sands, navigating the concrete corridors surrounded by heavily armed security and sycophants. He moved through the bowels of the building like a feudal lord inspecting his domain, actively avoiding any unauthorized contact with the legitimate tourists who funded his salary. Furthermore, he recognized that the raw electric energy of his Vegas residency could be aggressively packaged and sold. In 1966, he explicitly ordered the recording of a live album, Sinatra at the Sands, backed by Count Basie's orchestra. This was not merely a musical endeavor, it was a calculated piece of audio propaganda. The heavy clinking of ice in his glass, the raucous laughter of the mob-connected audience, and his arrogant, off-the-cuff monologues were deliberately captured on vinyl. He was mass-producing the intoxicating myth of his own invincibility, pressing the dangerous allure of the Las Vegas underworld into millions of sterile suburban living rooms across America. He also formalized his drinking culture into a grotesque parody of an exclusive fraternity. He distributed custom-embroidered blazers to his inner circle bearing the crest of the Jack Daniels Country Club. It was a cynical manufactured uniform designed to visually separate his loyal, sleep-deprived vassals from the disposable casino patrons. This carefully cultivated illusion of supreme power eventually fueled a dangerous new ambition within him. Sinatra no longer just wanted to entertain audiences in a smoky casino showroom. He felt he had outgrown Las Vegas. He wanted to transcend entertainment. He wanted to be a legitimate political kingmaker on the national stage. He wanted to influence the White House directly. During the fiercely contested 1960 presidential election, Joe Kennedy recognized Sinatra's unique utility. Joe Kennedy was the ruthless patriarch of the Kennedy political dynasty. Kennedy operated with the exact same cold, calculated pragmatism as the mafia bosses he dealt with. He understood the brutal, mechanical nature of acquiring federal power. Kennedy cynically used Sinatra as a secure, deniable bridge. He needed a conduit to negotiate directly with the criminal underworld. He needed to speak with notorious Chicago mafia boss Sam Giancana, but he could not be seen doing it himself. The political strategy was brutally simple, undeniably effective, and entirely illegal. The mob possessed absolute violent control over the most powerful American labor unions. They also possessed vast reserves of untraceable dark money generated directly from the Las Vegas skimming operations that Sinatra was actively shielding. Kennedy needed to deploy this criminal infrastructure. He needed to guarantee his son, John F. Kennedy's, victory in crucial, tightly contested swing states. The primary targets were the deeply corrupt electoral machines operating in Illinois and West Virginia. Sinatra eagerly acted as the enthusiastic middleman. He arranged the private meetings. He facilitated the flow of information between the political elite and the criminal syndicate. He brought Sam Giancana to the table. The mob mobilized their union leaders. They deployed their cash. They intimidated voters and manipulated ballot boxes in key districts. When JFK narrowly won the presidency in November 1960, defeating Richard Nixon by a razor-thin margin, Sinatra was ecstatic. He harbored the intense, blinding illusion that his sheer personal influence had tipped the scales of American democracy. He truly believed he had personally installed the President of the United States into the Oval Office. He believed he had successfully merged the glittering power of Hollywood, the brutal muscle of the mafia, and the legitimate authority of the White House. He believed he was the undisputed architect of this untouchable, unholy trinity. He personally organized the massive star-studded inaugural gala for the new president in Washington, D.C. Standing in the Capitol wearing a custom tuxedo and surrounded by federal power, he felt he had finally achieved permanent relevance. He believed he would never be discarded again. He believed he was untouchable. This manufactured political high was fundamentally flawed. He failed to understand that the legitimate federal government operates with a cold-blooded ruthlessness that makes the mafia look sentimental. The exact moment he served his purpose, the political machine violently pivoted, marking him not as a powerful ally, but as a severe federal liability. He believed he had successfully fused the American mafia and the United States government into a single cohesive unit operating under his personal influence. But the political betrayal that immediately followed the 1960 election was swift, absolute, and deeply humiliating. The American political machine is fundamentally more ruthless, efficient, and cold-blooded than the Chicago outfit. The exact moment John F. Kennedy placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office, the strategic landscape violently shifted. The Kennedy administration had successfully extracted the votes. They had utilized the mob's dark money. They no longer needed the criminal syndicate. In fact, the mafia was now an active, monumental political liability. The president's brother, the newly appointed Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy launched a merciless, unprecedented legal war. He weaponized the United States Department of Justice. He specifically targeted the very organized crime bosses who had just helped secure his brother's election. He formed the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section. He subpoenaed Sam Giancana. He targeted the Chicago outfit with federal indictments. Furthermore, the powerful and deeply paranoid FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, explicitly approached the president. Hoover delivered damning, undeniable, and classified wiretap evidence directly to the Oval Office. The FBI had successfully bugged the mafia's most secure locations. The secret audio recordings were devastating to Sinatra's carefully constructed illusion of power. The tapes captured high-ranking mafia figures, openly bragging and laughing. They were recorded explicitly discussing how they were actively manipulating the White House through their eager, naive lapdog, Frank Sinatra. They did not respect him. They viewed him as a useful, controllable idiot. Politically cornered and facing a massive presidency-destroying scandal, the president was forced to act immediately. His political advisors mandated a total, ruthless severance. The administration could not survive a public link to the Chicago outfit. JFK was forced to immediately and entirely cut all personal and public ties with the singer. The doors to the White House were permanently slammed shut in Sinatra's face, but the final crushing physical blow to Sinatra's massive ego did not happen in Washington. It occurred in March 1962 in the California desert. Sinatra had aggressively lobbied for and anticipated a glorious publicized presidential visit to his private home in Palm Springs. He desperately wanted to show the world his absolute proximity to ultimate federal power. He intended to use this visit to publicly validate his status as an untouchable political kingmaker. He spent vast amounts of his own personal wealth transforming his desert compound into a fortified presidential command center. He poured thick, heavy industrial concrete to build a military-grade helicopter pad. This pad was constructed strictly to accommodate the massive weight and logistical requirements of the Marine One presidential transport. He paid federal contractors to install a secure, direct telephone line. This classified line connected his private living room directly to the Pentagon. It was installed solely to accommodate JFK's immediate national security needs. He completely remodeled his guest houses to comfortably soothe the heavily armed Secret Service detail. He installed flagpoles. He prepared for a coronation. At the very last minute, the White House abruptly and permanently canceled the visit. The Kennedy administration, advised by the FBI, deemed Sinatra far too toxic and legally compromised. They could not risk a photograph of the president standing in the home of a man who openly fraternized with the Chicago outfit. Instead of staying with Sinatra, the president chose to stay at the nearby estate of Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby was a rival, legendary singer. More importantly, Crosby possessed a clean, conservative, and entirely mob-free public image. The humiliation was profound and painfully public. The entire American political and entertainment press corps witnessed the rejection. The world saw the chairman of the board publicly cast aside. A devastated, politically castrated, and violently enraged Sinatra completely lost his mind. He grabbed a heavy steel sledgehammer from a maintenance shed on his property. He walked out onto his newly built, massively expensive helipad. He frantically and violently smashed the poured concrete to pieces with his own bare hands under the blistering desert sun. He physically destroyed the concrete manifestation of his own political irrelevance. He realized the White House had used him, extracted his value, and ruthlessly discarded him. Sinatra, however, refused to learn his lesson regarding his actual place in the hierarchy of power. He still firmly believed the mafia's lie. He still believed he existed entirely above the law. This blinding, toxic arrogance led directly to the Cal Neva Lodge disaster in the summer of 1963. Sinatra owned a significant, controlling financial share of the Cal Neva Casino. It was a unique, highly profitable property located in Lake Tahoe. The building literally straddled the physical border of California and Nevada. In a blatant public display of defiance against state authorities, Sinatra openly hosted mob B. Os Sam Gincana at the property. Giancana was physically present in the hotel chalets. He was seen socializing with Sinatra and other guests. He was treating the legitimate casino as his own private clubhouse. This was a direct, undeniable, and documented violation of state gaming law. Sam Giancana was officially listed in Nevada's Black Book. The Black Book is a strict, legally binding state document maintained by gaming regulators. It permanently barred Giancana from ever setting foot inside any legal casino in the state of Nevada. Any casino owner caught hosting a Black Book member faced immediate severe legal consequences, including the total loss of their gaming licenses. When Ed Olson, the rigorous and entirely uncorrupted chairman of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, learned of this, he acted immediately. Olson launched an official state investigation. He sent state agents directly to the Cal Neva property to document Giancana's physical presence. When Sinatra found out about the state investigation, he completely lost his temper. Believing he was entirely untouchable by local bureaucrats, he called Olson directly on the telephone. Sinatra unleashed a vicious, unhinged torrent of profanity. He hurled severe personal insults at the state official. More disastrously, he made explicit, documented threats of physical violence against Olson. He attempted to use mafia intimidation tactics on a sworn state regulator. He tried to bully the government, but the state bureaucratic apparatus was unyielding. It was unimpressed by his celebrity status, his wealth, or his mafia connections. The government moved swiftly and without a shred of mercy. The Nevada Gaming Control Board initiated proceedings to permanently revoke all of Sinatra's lucrative gambling licenses. He was legally and forcibly removed from the Nevada gaming industry. He was forced to liquidate his casino shares in both the Cal Neva and the Sands. He had to sell his holdings at a massive, devastating FINA NCIL loss. In his moment of absolute legal and financial crisis, the silence from his so-called powerful allies was deafening. The Kennedy family completely ignored his existence. The White House offered zero protection. The political bridge was burned to ash. More tellingly, the mafia bosses he so deeply admired and protected entirely abandoned him to the state. The criminal underworld made a cold, calculated business decision. They looked at their ledgers. They decided they would rather throw a famous loudmouth singer to the bureaucratic wolves than risk drawing federal investigators into their highly profitable Las Vegas skimming operations. They cut him loose the exact moment his arrogance threatened their bottom line. The mob prized the flow of untraceable cash of far more than they prized Frank Sinatra. He was, once again, discarded. The total loss of his gaming licenses and the sudden chilling silence from his mafia handlers shattered his carefully constructed reality. He was entirely, horrifyingly isolated once again. This renewed vulnerability triggered a psychological collapse, turning his private life into a paranoid, heavily guarded prison, just as the desert city around him prepared for a ruthless corporate takeover. The repeated brutal abandonments by both the legitimate political world and the criminal underworld deeply fractured Sinatra's psyche. He had been discarded by Columbia Records. He had been discarded by the White House. He had been discarded by the Chicago outfit. This relentless cycle of utilization and disposal led to severe destructive behavioral coping mechanisms. He developed a profound, crippling psychological fear of enclosed spaces and utter silence. This clinical psychiatric condition is known as somnophobia. The silence of the night terrified him. The quiet reminded him entirely of the terrifying irrelevance of his 1950s downfall. When the music stopped and the crowds left, he was forced to face his own reality. It forcefully reminded him of his precarious, fragile status. He was constantly reminded that he was a mere employee. He was a biological asset working for murderers and politicians who could and did discard him at any moment. Consequently, he refused to sleep before dawn. He viewed sleep as a vulnerable surrender to the void. He effectively held his inner circle hostage. The famous Rat Pack, his massive bodyguards, and various women were trapped in his sprawling hotel suites. He aggressively forced them to stay awake. He mandated that they consume heavy pours of Jack Daniel's whiskey until the sun finally came up over the Nevada desert. He desperately used their forced noise, their exhausted laughter, and their physical presence to fill the gaping, terrifying void of his own internal isolation. If a member of his entourage attempted to leave the suite to sleep, Sinatra viewed it as a profound personal betrayal. He also lived his daily life in a constant, suffocating state of paranoia. He intimately knew the brutal, violent history of Las Vegas. He understood exactly how the mafia operated. He knew exactly how the mob had ruthlessly assassinated visionary casino builders like Bugsy Siegel. Siegel was shot through the eye the exact moment his usefulness expired, or he became a financial liability to the bosses back east. Sinatra lived in constant, underlying dread that he would eventually cross the wrong boss. He feared he would be deemed a liability, stripped of his protection, and violently eliminated. Because he could never safely direct his massive boiling anger at the White House or the armed mafia bosses who actually controlled him, he heavily utilized displaced aggression. He routinely directed his explosive rage, severe verbal abuse, and physical violence at innocent, entirely powerless people. He threw heavy ceramic plates at waiters who brought the wrong order. He verbally destroyed sound technicians in the recording studio for minor audio feedback. He physically intimidated low-level casino managers, hotel staff, and journalists who could not defend themselves, bullying those who could not fight back or legally retaliate was a pathetic psychological tool. He used it to convince himself he was still the dominant alpha male in the room. His personal relationships became entirely transactional and devoid of genuine vulnerability. He ruthlessly and permanently cut ties with his brother-in-law, the actor Peter Lawford. Lawford was married to JFK's sister. Sinatra blamed Lawford entirely for failing to secure the 1962 presidential visit to his Palm Springs compound. He banished Lawford from the Rat Pack forever. He completely destroyed the man's career and social standing in a single vindictive stroke. He forced his young, terrified wife, the actress Mia Farrow, to sign legal divorce papers right in the middle of a crowded film set. She was filming Rosemary's Baby. He sent his corporate lawyers directly to the set to serve her the papers in front of the entire cast and crew. He executed this massive public humiliation strictly to assert his dominance over her rising career. He was punishing her for prioritizing the film over his immediate demands. Even his historically praised defense of Sammy Davis Jr. was fundamentally rooted in a need for control. Davis faced severe, systemic racial segregation in Las Vegas. When casinos refused to let Davis sleep in the hotels where he performed, Sinatra threatened to pull his own highly lucrative shows. He protected Davis, but not purely out of enlightened moral outrage or a deep commitment to civil rights. He protected him to forcefully enact a strict underworld rule he had learned from the mafia. That specific rule states that absolutely no one is allowed to disrespect a member of the boss's inner circle without facing severe, immediate consequences from the boss himself. Sinatra was actively playing the role of a mafia don. He used a civil rights issue to assert his own personal authority over the casino managers. He was a man completely hollowed out by fear. He was functioning entirely on aggression, alcohol, and the desperate need to maintain an illusion of control that he never truly possessed. This desperate need for control collided violently with reality in September 1967. The entire economic structure of Las Vegas was shifting rapidly beneath his feet. The romanticized era of the mafia's blood brotherhood was officially over. It was being permanently replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of corporate balance sheets. It was replaced by audited profit margins and federal compliance. The eccentric, ruthless corporate billionaire Howard Hughes arrived in the desert. Hughes aggressively purchased the Sands Hotel and Casino directly from the mob. The mafia executives executed a massive, profitable exit strategy. They sold the property to Hughes for $14.6 million in legitimate, clean capital. The mob successfully washed their money and walked away. They completely left Sinatra behind to deal with the new corporate overlords alone. One of the very first actions taken by the new, strict corporate management was a massive financial audit. The corporate accountants reviewed the casino ledgers. They immediately noticed the massive, uncollected gambling debts accumulated by Frank Sinatra. The new corporate managers did not care about his legendary voice. They did not care about his cultural influence or his terrifying mafia connections. To the accountants, he was simply an overpaid entertainer operating with an unacceptable multi-million-dollar financial deficit. They completely severed his unlimited complimentary gambling credit. He was abruptly told he could no longer gamble with the house's money. To Sinatra, this was not a standard corporate policy change. It was an act of profound, unforgivable disrespect. He felt he was being publicly, financially, and symbolically castrated by accountants in cheap suits. On Saturday, September 9, 1967, he erupted into a deeply childish frenzy. He marched onto the crowded casino floor of the Sands. He physically flipped over a heavy baccarat table, scattering chips and terrifying the legitimate tourists. He commandeered a motorized golf cart. He drove the heavy vehicle straight through a massive, expensive plate glass hotel window. He physically ripped telephone wires completely out of the hotel walls. He screamed unhinged demands to be connected directly to Howard Hughes. Hughes, operating from a heavily guarded sealed penthouse, completely ignored him. The corporate billionaire refused to even acknowledge the aging singer's existence. The facade of the chairman was about to be shattered. This tantrum was a pathetic, destructive display of a man refusing to accept his own corporate obsolescence. He genuinely believed his sheer Celebrity status would force the new corporate owners to immediately capitulate. He was about to learn a brutal physical lesson. In the new audited era of Las Vegas, the chairman's ego mattered far less than the bottom line. The cold slap of absolute reality was delivered the following morning. On Sunday, September 10th, an exhausted, hungover, and enraged Sinatra stormed into the hotel coffee shop. He intended to publicly humiliate and physically confront Carl Cohen. Cohen was the casino's newly retained executive manager. Sinatra fundamentally miscalculated his target. Cohen was not a low-level, easily intimidated waiter. He was not a compliant sound technician or a nervous studio executive. Carl Cohen was a hardened, heavily built, 110-kilogram former mob associate. He was a ruthless operator who had survived the deadly street wars of the 1940s. Sinatra marched up to Cohen's table. He began screaming vile personal insults at the manager. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Sinatra grabbed a heavy glass pot of scalding hot coffee. He threw the boiling water and the heavy glass directly at Cohen's chest. Cohen did not hesitate, did not flinch, and he certainly did not cower before the global celebrity. As Cohen stepped forward and planted his feet firmly on the coffee shop floor, the inevitable reality of Sinatra's position finally crystallized. The devastating right-handed hook that followed, the very blow that snapped his porcelain teeth and sent him collapsing onto the plush carpet in a pool of his own blood, as established in the opening of our story, was more than physical trauma. It was a definitive corporate execution. Bleeding and profoundly humiliated before a crowd of shocked tourists and silent casino staff, Sinatra immediately screamed for his underworld connections. He demanded the Chicago outfit dispatch armed hitmen to Las Vegas to kill Cohen immediately. He demanded ultimate retribution for the physical disrespect, but the high-ranking mafia bosses entirely refused his demands. They delivered a response of absolute, freezing silence. The mob had just received tens of millions of legitimate, audited dollars from Howard Hughes. They had successfully washed their capital and exited the property. They were absolutely not about to jeopardize a historic financial windfall. They would never risk bringing the FBI down on their heads over the bruised ego and broken teeth of an aging, volatile singer. This single punch stripped away the final, lingering remnants of Sinatra's dignity. It definitively proved to him and to the entire world exactly what he was. He was, and always had been, nothing more than a highly paid employee. He was a corporate asset whose leverage had entirely expired. He was forced to quietly call an emergency dentist to his room to repair his shattered mouth. He had to pack his own bags in absolute silence. He fled in total disgrace down the Las Vegas Strip to Caesar's Palace. The era of Frank Sinatra's perceived invincibility and untouchable power ended forever on that coffee shop floor. Yet, his forced relocation to Caesar's Palace did not temper his volatile arrogance. He aggressively attempted to overcompensate for his physical humiliation by demanding an unprecedented, extortionate salary of $100,000 per week from the new property. He treated the Caesar staff with the exact same venomous contempt he had deployed at the Sands, desperate to prove he still commanded the city. The absolute breaking point of his Las Vegas dominance occurred 3 years later, in September 1970. Sinatra was aggressively gambling at the high-stakes baccarat tables inside Caesar's Palace in the early hours of the morning. He began suffering massive financial losses. He angrily demanded that the casino pit bosses immediately raise the table limits to allow him to win his money back. The corporate management strictly refused. Sinatra exploded into his trademark hysteria. He began screaming obscenities and throwing heavy casino chips directly at the faces of the card dealers. The casino manager on duty was Sanford Waterman. Waterman was a hardened veteran casino executive who had zero patience for aging, tantrum-throwing singers. He did not engage in a fistfight like Carl Cohen. Waterman walked directly up to Sinatra's baccarat table, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a loaded .38 caliber revolver. Waterman aimed the gun squarely at Sinatra's chest. He explicitly ordered the chairman to back away from the table and leave the property immediately. Staring directly down the steel barrel of a loaded weapon, Sinatra was paralyzed. His mafia bodyguards did nothing. He was once again forced to back down by the very system he thought he controlled. This second, even more terrifying public humiliation fundamentally broke his Vegas spirit. Shortly after staring down Waterman's revolver, an emasculated and terrified Sinatra abruptly announced his official retirement from show business in 1971. He fled the Nevada desert entirely, unable to cope with a corporate landscape that now literally held him at gunpoint. His self-imposed exile from the Nevada desert was short-lived, driven by a compulsive need for the spotlight and the massive financial deficit of his lavish lifestyle. He orchestrated a highly publicized return in 1973, signing an unprecedented contract with Caesar's Palace. But the desert he returned to was increasingly lethal to his personal life. The darkest moment of his Las Vegas residency occurred in January 1977. His mother, Dolly Sinatra, the fierce matriarch who originally engineered his ruthless ambition, boarded a private Gates Learjet to watch him perform his opening night at Caesars. The aircraft slammed violently into the snow-covered ridge of the San Gorgonio mountain, instantly killing everyone on board. He was forced to cancel his performances, pacing the halls of his Caesars Palace suite, while recovery teams pulled her remains from the wreckage. The city that had resurrected his career had now exacted a devastating, irreplaceable blood toll. Despite the profound personal tragedies and his previous violent expulsions, his obsession with the authority of the casino floor remained untamed. He realized that to truly operate within the new sanitized Las Vegas, he needed to permanently erase the legal stains of his mafia past. In 1981, he initiated a massive, heavily financed legal campaign to force the Nevada Gaming Control Board to reinstate his revoked gambling licenses. He did not rely on street-level thugs this time. He utilized a newly acquired, highly polished federal shield. He had aggressively aligned himself with the newly elected president, Ronald Reagan. Armed with glowing character references from sitting politicians and high-priced corporate attorneys, he overwhelmed the state regulators. He won his license back, immediately signing a staggering $16 million performance contract with casino magnate Steve Wynn at the Golden Nugget. He had successfully transitioned from a mob-controlled asset to a heavily insured, audited corporate commodity operating within the very system that had previously humiliated him. In the 1980s and 1990s, the physical reality of human biology caught up with the remaining members of the Rat Pack. They slowly aged, fell severely ill, and died off one by one. Las Vegas transformed once again. It mutated into a massive, sanitized, family-friendly corporate destination. It became a publicly traded theme park completely unrecognizable from the dangerous mob-run city he had helped build. Sinatra was reduced to a living, breathing relic of a bygone, violent era. His once impeccable, razor-sharp memory began to severely fail him. He could no longer naturally recall the phrasing of his own legendary music. He was forced to rely heavily on electronic teleprompters. These digital screens were placed strategically around the stage, hidden from the audience. He needed them just to remember the basic lyrics to the very songs he had sung 1,000 times over the decades. He was an aging worker struggling to keep up with the strict demands of the assembly line. Frank Sinatra died in May 1998 following a fatal heart attack. He was 82 years old. In a profoundly telling, deeply psychological final gesture, his family ensured he was buried with a specific, deliberate set of items. In his casket, they placed a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey. They placed a pack of unfiltered Camel cigarettes and a Zippo lighter. But most importantly, they placed 10 small dimes in his pocket. These 10 dimes were meant for a public payphone. This specific item represented a deeply ingrained trauma-induced habit, born not from his early career failures, but from pure parental terror. It was a direct consequence of the infamous 1963 kidnapping of his son, Frank Sinatra Jr. During the agonizing high-stakes ransom negotiations, Sinatra had been forced to use public payphones to communicate with the kidnappers. In one crucial life-or-death call, he ran out of dimes and the connection was abruptly severed. The sheer panic of that disconnected line left a permanent paralyzing scar on his psyche. He vowed to never again find himself caught without the immediate means to make a desperate call. Even in death, the chairman of the board anticipated total abandonment. He went to his grave fully expecting the machine to cut his lines of communication. When the news of his death broke across the globe, the massive towering casinos on the Las Vegas Strip executed a coordinated public relations maneuver. They briefly dimmed their neon lights in a highly orchestrated show of corporate respect. It was a sterile, cost-free tribute organized by boardroom executives. Yet, beneath the manufactured glamour, the tailored suits, and the legendary music, his life remains a stark, unyielding historical lesson. It proves definitively that no individual, regardless of their immense talent, their global fame, or their perceived political power, can ever outgrow the system. No single man can outsmart the brutal, mechanical, and entirely unfeeling flow of capital and corporate interests. The chairman of the board never truly owned the company. He was never the boss. He was simply the most famous, highly compensated worker on the neon assembly line. He was actively utilized, manipulated, and squeezed for revenue until his very last dying breath.